Since the scenario I'm painting is a science fiction one, I've tried to place the story in the context of scientific discovery and of science fiction. But as we'll see, the developments in New Testament studies and around and that have inspired new developments in New Testament studies since the was last occupied are in some ways every bit as startling. And developments in technology have at key moments been part of that story. So what happens when we wake up the New Testament professor who has had the opportunity to skip over the past 60 years? We'll give him a few moments to explore the building, and before we try to talk to him about anything else, he may want some explanation of what happened to the Butler School of Religion. It was, after all, housed right here in Robertson Hall, a new building on campus designed for that purpose, or designated for that purpose. Hopefully, once we reassured him that, on the one hand, the School of Religion had taken on a new life down the road as CTS, and that we have what I think is a vibrant religion program housed in the Department of Philosophy and Religion over in Jordan Hall, we might be able to turn the conversation from developments at Butler to developments in the study of the New Testament and the Bible. Since we've already mentioned the Second World War, it's worth noting that the war ended only a few years before the Goodwin chair ceased to be occupied. The creation of the modern state of Israel, numerous archaeological digs and discoveries in the region, and much else would directly or indirectly result in the intervening years. For instance, the work of Dame Kathleen Kenyon excavating Jericho in the 1950s overturned some overconfident assertions that had been made after John Garstang's excavations in the 1930s, which at that time it appeared to many to have confirmed the biblical accounts of the fall of Jericho. The hopes of the biblical archaeology movement to prove the Bible using a spade turned out to be misplaced, as the archaeological record turned up lots of interesting stuff, but evidence which both confirmed and contradicted at times stories found on the pages of the Bible. Our recently unfrozen professor might be in for a shock. More directly related to the legacy of World War II on the study of the New Testament, scholars from the 1950s onwards have been far more aware of the issue of anti-Semitism and the effects of the polemical language in the New Testament in fostering bigotry and ultimately contributing to murder and genocide. Nowhere is this issue more poignantly felt than in the study of the Gospel of John, on which I did my doctoral research. In John's Gospel, the opponents of Jesus are regularly referred to simply as the Jews, and are said to have had the devil as their father. In chapter 8, I might add, a verse which turned up in the news recently in a context that is perhaps less surprising than might have first appeared to be the case. It was odd. There was the company making scopes for military rifles was printing Bible verses on them, as you may be aware. Of course, a sensitive reading of the Gospels might have noticed that Peter, the famous apostle, is called Satan, and not merely a son of Satan in the other Gospels. And so the opponents in the Gospel of John seem to have gotten off somewhat more lightly than one of Jesus' closest friends. At any rate, if new sensitivity to such matters characterized the decades that followed the Second World War, a better context within which to make sense of such language was provided by one of the most remarkable manuscript discoveries of the 20th century. If things that were lost and then found once again are natural to connect with the Goodwin chair, there are important archaeological and textual discoveries that fit under that heading, and which were published and made accessible in the decades since the Goodwin chair was last occupied. Foremost among them is the Dead Sea Scrolls. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 and continued for almost a decade. It would be some time before they would begin to be published, and many decades would pass before they would all be published. The Dead Sea Scrolls are significant not least because they provided, for the first time, the perspective of a Jewish group from close to New Testament times, offering their own views in their own words. Before this, it was assumed that the Pharisees, or emergent rabbinic Judaism, represented a clear orthodoxy, with those whose views differed representing heretics and apostates. But the discovery of these scrolls illustrated that there were other groups, substantial in number, who were aiming to be faithful to the traditions and scriptures of Judaism, and who were involved in vigorous disagreements with and debates with others, including the Pharisees. What's more, much of the symbolism in early Christian writings like the Gospel of John that had been assumed previously to reflect the influence of non-Jewish thought could now be seen to be drawing on symbolism and traditions within Judaism, rather than from outside it. The imagery of light versus sons of darkness, for instance, and the authors of the Dead Sea texts referred to fellow Jews who disagreed with them as sons of Beliar, Beliar being a major demon. This is perhaps slightly better than calling someone a son of Satan or Satan, but it is nevertheless similar. A greater awareness of the prevalence of such rhetoric in debates between religious groups in ancient Judaism helps provide more of a framework and context for understanding the New Testament instances. Rhetoric of this sort is quite frequent in texts from this time, and I couldn't find a close English, equivalent in American English, but having lived in the UK, it seems to me that both culturally and linguistically, the phrase children of the devil in ancient Jewish and Christian literature seems to have been used approximately the same way as the phrase in modern British parliamentary English, I respectfully disagree with the right honourable gentleman. Our greater understanding of ancient Judaism affected many aspects of the study of the New Testament. In the study of Paul's letters, E.P. Sanders challenged the tendency to characterize the Judaism of New Testament times as legalistic. And in the study of the historical Jesus, the past 60 years have seen an enormous increase not only in scholarly attention to Jesus as a Jewish figure, but also in Jewish scholars themselves writing about Jesus. A find such as the Dead Sea Scrolls was remarkable, and so it's even more remarkable that we have a second set of texts that was rediscovered in the same time period. And that discovery has allowed us to fill in still more pieces of the puzzle and provide still more of the context of early Christianity as it developed in and beyond the New Testament. In 1945, in the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, a collection of 12 ancient books was discovered by a local peasant. And they remained in that family's possession for some time, and first began to be noticed by experts in Coptic in 1948. Their publication would eventually follow, and their contents turned out to include writings of those individuals and groups usually referred to as Gnostics, or under the heading of Gnosticism. Both of these finds might have just reached the ears of the Goodwin chair in the late 40s, news of the finds at least, but their contents would not become known, much less made accessible, for some time after that. And both these collections of texts have helped us to make sense of the New Testament, providing information about the diversity of Judaism as the background to the rise of Christianity. The second by providing some indication of the diversity of early Christianity itself. As a result of the publication of the Nag Hammadi texts and their sensationalization, I should say, in books like the Da Vinci Code, most people today have heard of Gnostics and Gnosticism. Yet, ironically, few are aware that there is a Gnostic group that has survived from antiquity down to the present day. Along the borderlands of Iraq and Iran, down the centuries, a group usually referred to as the Mandaeans have persisted. They are a baptizing group with sacred texts written in a dialect of Aramaic, which of course is also the language Jesus spoke. Their texts mention John the Baptist and Jesus, the former positively, the latter less so. For those who have taught or taken C&T, you may have encountered the Mandaeans before under another name. The Quran mentions Sabians, along with Jews and Christians, as people of the book, and those Sabians were almost certainly Mandaeans. Sabiun, or Sabians, being an Arabic term which means baptizers, and it's a term that's used for the Mandaeans in a clearer way in later Arabic sources. The Mandaeans would start to come to the attention of English-speaking scholars as a result of the work of Ethel Drower, the wife of a British ambassador to Iraq during the mid-20th century. She managed to become a friend of the Mandaeans, and as a result, acquired copies of many of their texts. Those manuscripts now reside in the Bombay and are known as the Drower Collection. In 1937, she published a book which was essentially an ethnography about the Mandaeans, but it wouldn't be until the period from 1949 until the 1960s that she would publish English translations of some of their texts, some of which are interesting in terms of their illustrations and form as well as their content. In 1941, the famous New Testament scholar Rudolf Bultmann published a commentary on the Gospel of John in his native German, one that wasn't translated into English until 1971. In it, Bultmann explored the possibility that the Mandaeans might somehow be connected with the followers of John the Baptist, and that their writings might therefore provide the background to the Gospel of John. So we come full circle back to John again. Although many details of this hypothesis have rightly been called into question, certain obstacles have prevented detailed engagement with it, not least the fact that neither of the two most central Mandaean texts, the Great Treasure, or Ginza Ruba, and the Book of John, has yet been translated into English in its entirety. And I mention this because I'm clearly interested in the subject, and translating the latter, the Mandaean Book of John, is now near the top of my own list of research priorities. The last time a translation of the Mandaean Book of John was made into a European language, it was before the Nag Hammadi scrolls had been found, much less published. And so this seems like a perfect moment to bring together the disparate threads of what we now know about ancient Gnosticism, including sources for consideration that were rediscovered relatively recently, and sources that have never been translated into English, and giving them an opportunity to illuminate one another as well as our understanding of Judaism and Christianity in antiquity.